Book 3, Part 13. We heard the door open, but whoever was talking was keeping it too low for us to hear. Aaron was facing the door, crouched a bit, and ready. I was actually impressed. Finally, someone knocked on the door, and then Track gave the all clear. Aaron stood and opened it, and we both stepped out. I smiled to see Ryan there, and ran over and hugged him. He laughed and hugged me back. "So, will you tell me what's going on?" I asked, looking up at him. He nodded. "In a bit." I sighed. That basically meant no. "Pack it up," he stated, and the guys all started to grab their things. "Again?" I moaned, and Ryan nodded. "I'm afraid so. I want as many miles between us and them as possible tonight." "Who exactly is them?" I tried, but Ryan had turned and was talking to Cal. "You and Aaron can stay here tonight. The room is paid for. Then you can head back tomorrow. We really appreciate your help." "We're coming with you," Cal stated, and my eyes widened. "If you'll have us," the owl saw wolf quickly added. "You belong with your pack," Ryan stated, but I looked up at him. His voice was softer, with no rumble. He would let them come if they wanted. That surprised me. Cal seemed to notice too and smiled. "They'll understand," was all he said. Ryan gave a nod, and everyone continued to grab our things. Phil came out of the bedroom with my duffel bag in his hand. It was zipped now, and I bit my lip. He winked at me and then held out my coat. "How's the arm?" Ryan asked as I took my jacket, but didn't put it on. I lifted it. "Cleaned and splinted, Captain," I stated with a smile. He nodded again and I frowned. Ryan was tensed and all business. I headed towards the door and Phil grabbed my arm. I waited and then moaned when Track, Jackson, and Rock surrounded me as we left. I made it trotting down the steps a little hard. When we piled into the car, I saw Aaron and Rock lifting the bikes into the back of another car. Jackson was driving this car, and Ryan was up front with him. Cal and Track were on the other seat, and Phil sat next to me. I looked over and saw the other SUV in the back. "Where to, boss?" Jackson stated as he backed up and then headed towards the main road. "South," Ryan stated. "Will do," Jackson replied, and then turned west. I shook my head and leaned back. There was no point asking right now. A phone rang up front, and Ryan put it to his ear. He talked low, and I didn't try to listen. I probably wouldn't understand it anyhow. Then Ryan turned, and he looked ticked. I sat up and saw his jaw twitch. A very bad sign. "It seems we have us a stowaway," he said, with a very deep growl at the end. Then he turned and looked right at Cal. "Al!" The owl saw Wolf gasp, and then he moaned when Ryan gave a hard nod. "Al!" I gasped, turning to look out the back window. "How in the world?" I whispered, completely dumbfounded. Then I clamped my jaw shut. Ryan wasn't just ticked because Cal's little brother was with us. He was ticked because that little boy had been hiding in the SUV that Ryan drove, and our Alpha hadn't even noticed. I turned back around and lowered my eyes. Ryan's talents weren't in his nose, and I was sure Al slithered in there without any of the wolves noticing either, but I kept my mouth shut. Cal leaned forward and buried his head in his hands. It was one thing for him to be on this crazy adventure, but now we had a very small wolf to worry about, and he had his little brother. The car was very quiet for the rest of the ride. I looked out the window and watched the scenes pass by. What were we going to do about Al? He was too little to be running around in this mess. How old was he again? 5, maybe 6? My stomach tightened and I put my hand over it. Phil leaned over and kissed my cheek, but neither of us said anything. Ryan's rage was thick in the air, and we all knew to keep as quiet as possible. Finally, Jackson pulled off into a gas station. My senses picked up on the human sense as soon as the car door opened. I quickly jumped up and nearly plastered my face to the window. There were half a dozen cars and trucks here, all fueling up. I gasped when Rock's face appeared on the other side of the tinted glass. He laughed and opened the door, letting more of the smells roll in. "I'm grabbing some food," he stated, looking past me. "Can I come?" I asked quietly. Rock actually looked surprised, and I widened my eyes innocently. "Fat chance," Track chuckled, pushing me back and hopping out. He shook his head at me as he shut the door. I stuck my tongue out as they walked towards the store and then sat back. Cal had gotten out on the other side, and I turned, looking over the back seat as he got in the other car. "Poor Al," I whispered, and Phil chuckled. "I would hate to be that pup right about now." I could see Cal through the dark windows and saw him yelling down at the front seat. With the bikes in the back, there was only one seat for anyone to sit in. Aaron and Rock had been riding in it, and Al must be up front. "How are we going to get him back home?" I asked, feeling for the little boy that was being berated by his older brother. Deserved or not, I felt like I might need to rescue him. "We'll figure it out tomorrow." I stiffened and looked at the front seat where Ryan was sitting. Oops, I forgot about him being up there. Phil looked at his phone. "About another 30 minutes, he stated, and our alpha nodded. When I looked at my wolf, he tapped the phone. "Until it's too late to keep going." "Oh," I sighed and lowered my head. The guys finally piled into the car and we headed out again. I watched the humans pump their gas and trot in and out of the little store. I didn't know why they amazed me so much all of a sudden, but I kept watching them as we drove out. Chapter 15. The next place actually had adjoining rooms, sort of. There was a door between the two actual suites, and I was impressed with how nice it was. I pursed my lips sadly when Al walked in, his hand tight in his older brother's, and his little eyes were red from crying. He smiled at me, though, and gave me a quick wave before he was walked past me and into one of the rooms. "I feel so bad for him," I whispered into Phil's ear as he hung up my coat in a closet near the door. "So do I," he replied, "but what he did was extremely dangerous." "Yeah, I knew that, but still." I bit my lower lip and then turned. Ryan was snapping orders and we were all jumpy. Phil took my hand and walked me to one of the bedrooms. "There's a TV in here and you can change and relax," he stated, looking back at the door. I nodded and he sat my bag on one of the double beds, kissed me and headed back out, shutting the door behind me. I sighed as I unzipped my bag and pulled out a pair of pajama bottoms. Someone knocked quickly and I called out. Phil opened the door and brought in his own bag, sitting on the floor at the end of the same bed. That made me smile. He gave me another quick kiss and then left. I pulled one of my t-shirts out and then changed into my pajama bottoms quickly, worried somebody would walk in. I whipped off my sweater and then looked at Phil's bag and grinned. I unzipped it, pulled out one of his t-shirts, and quickly pulled it over my head before I lost my nerve. Then I pushed our bags together at the end of the bed, grabbed the remote, and climbed into the bed. I was still channel surfing when someone knocked again, and Phil came in when I called out. "We're going to be up talking for a bit." I saw him look down at my shirt, his shirt. Suddenly, I wished I had just worn my own, but then he smiled and sat on the edge of the bed. When he didn't say anything, I shifted uneasily and he leaned forward. You have no idea how much of a turn-on that is. My eyes nearly popped out of my head and I leaned back against the pillow. He moved closer and nodded, his eyes sparkling. I swallowed hard and then Track barged in. I call this bed, he stated, throwing another bag over on the bed across the room. Well, across the room meaning 2 feet away from this one. Phil smiled at me and sat up, just a little. I grabbed the blanket and quickly pulled it up against my chest. Track frowned and looked over at us. Say goodnight and come on, we have a meeting. Then Track looked at me, tilted his head just a bit, shrugged and walked out, leaving the door open. I smiled and Phil gave a low growl, but grinned when he looked back at me. Should I take it off? I whispered. Phil's eyes bulged and I shook my head. I mean, should I put my own t-shirt on? Really? Come on now. Don't you dare, he whispered, smiling in a way that made me nervous and excited at the same time. In fact, I'm going to get rid of all your nightshirts now. Huh? He nodded. I like seeing you in mine. You mean you would rather have me wear this? I smiled, holding out the front of his shirt. Than some skimpy or lacy? Yep, he chuckled. Something in his eyes made me squirm a bit. I suddenly felt like dinner, meaning that I was the main course. Nervous, he whispered, and I quickly nodded. What the heck? It was just a t-shirt. I suddenly decided I was going to put my own back on the minute he left. Phil, came Ryan's voice, and he leaned forward and kissed me softly on the lips. He didn't pull back right away, and I felt my anxiety melt. I moaned, wrapping my good arm around his neck. There was a low growl from the other room, and Phil smiled at me. Get some sleep, he stated as he stood. When he got to the end of the bed, he bent down and picked up my duffel bag. Just so you don't try to change your mind, he stated, looking at my shirt. I pulled the covers up under my chin, and he winked and walked out of the room, taking my bag with him. I actually sat there dumbfounded, first about his reaction to me wearing his t-shirt, and then to him actually taking my bag so I couldn't change. I lowered the blankets and looked down, pulling the blue cotton shirt out a bit. It's just an old t-shirt, I whispered, completely confused. Then I remembered his eyes and his kiss. I put my fingers to my lips and smiled. At some point, I fell asleep, and at another, I woke up to Phil crawling into bed with me. I moaned and rolled over, laying my head on his chest and flopping my arm over his stomach. He kissed the top of my head, and I heard a soft warning growl from across the room. Shut up and go to sleep, Track, I whispered, half asleep. Phil chuckled and wrapped his arm around me. Night, Jim Bob, came a sound from the other side of Track, and I giggled into Phil's chest. Night, Elizabeth, Rock called from the living room. Go to sleep, came Ryan's quiet but deep voice, and everything went still. Just make sure you stay on top of those covers, Track whispered a minute later. Phil sighed and lifted his head a bit. Go to sleep, nursemaid. Jackson chuckled, and the room went silent again. When everyone started to wake up and move around, I moaned. I wasn't ready to get up. Phil hugged me to him and told me to go back to sleep. I smiled and tried to do just that, but Track's so-called whispering got louder and louder until I finally blinked my eyes open. Phil drew in a long, slow breath and kissed my forehead. I'll have to give him points for bravery, he said. I smiled, looked up, and kissed him under his chin. He moaned, and I repeated the kiss, keeping my lips against his skin just a second longer. His arms wrapped around me, and one hand slid up to the back of my neck. Ryan's ordering breakfast, came a loud voice, and I froze. This time, it was Jackson. I blinked up at Phil, whose jaw was tight now. "So what do you want?" Phil lifted his head. "How about a little privacy?" he snapped. "Not sure that's on the menu," Jackson laughed, and then walked over and plopped down on the side of the bed. I grunted as I was bounced, and Phil rolled onto his side, keeping one arm over my middle. "Look," Jackson stated, his voice smiling, "you're our clique alpha, and I do respect you and love you like a pack brother." I blinked and rolled over on my back, looking up at the intruder. Jackson smiled down at me and winked. "But, you know, she's Raina, and..." Then Phil leaned over me and shoved Jackson hard. He landed with a thud on the floor, and I put my good hand over my mouth and laughed. Jackson popped right back up, completely unaffected. He leaned his arms on the bed and nodded. "Certain things are just sacred, you know." Phil jumped up then, and Jackson hauled out of the room faster than I had seen him move in a long time. I sat up and shook my head. Did he really just call me sacred? Phil chuckled then, and I shivered. I feel like a great big golden cow or something now. "Who's a gold cow?" We both turned to see Rock walk in, and Phil threw his hands up in the air. I giggled and crawled out of bed, shrugging a "why bother" when Phil looked at me. He shoved Rock hard in the chest and walked into the bathroom. "What the heck was that for?" Rock snapped, rubbing his chest and looking at the door as it slammed closed. When he looked at me, I shrugged again, and he frowned. "Man, crazy wolves around here." Then he stepped up to the bathroom door. "Jackson said to come in and see what you wanted for breakfast." The growl from the other side of the door made my eyes widen. Rock frowned and looked at me again. "I don't know what he likes for breakfast," I giggled, and then frowned too, not liking that I didn't know that. "Meat," came a sharp voice from the bathroom. "Lots of meat." Somehow that meant something more to Rock, whose eyes opened wide. A large grin crossed his face, and then he laughed. "All right, man, you got it." With that, he winked at me and walked out of the room. Wow, boys were completely confusing. I was looking around for my bag when little Al walked in the room. His eyes still looked a bit red, and I bit my lower lip and knelt. He ran towards me, threw his arms around my neck, and started to cry. I gasped and sat down hard, pulling him into my lap. "What's wrong?" I whispered. "I am very sorry for what I did," he sobbed, burying his head in the crook of my neck. He was sitting in my lap, facing me, and he was holding me so tight my heart ached. I hugged him to me and rubbed the back of his hair. "Shh, now, it's going to be okay," I whispered, and without knowing why, I slowly began to rock him, whispering into his small ear while we sat in the middle of the floor. Cal walked in, and I glared up at him, holding Al protectively to me. Cal flinched and walked back out. Al sniffled and pulled back just a little, still keeping his arms around my neck. "I just wanted to come with my brother," he whispered. "I knew he wasn't going to come back." I wiped the small tears from his face. "What do you mean?" I whispered. "He has always wanted to leave Owlsaw," he stated, finally moving sideways in my lap. "I knew when he left with you that he wouldn't come back." He sniffled again, and I felt my chest tighten. "He's my only brother," the little boy whispered, looking down at his hands. "I just wanted to be with him." "Well then, you will," I stated firmly, and every part of me meant it. How could they turn him away from his only brother? I was determined that I would stand up to all of them if they tried. Al sniffled and looked to my side. "I'm sorry, Phil." I turned and saw Phil kneeling next to me and wondered how long he had been there. He was still in his sweatpants, but didn't have a shirt on. Wow, he was hot. I smiled at him, but he didn't smile back. I quickly pulled Al closer to me and wrapped my arms around him. You can't separate them, I stated hard. Phil sighed and looked at the two of us. Then he leaned over and kissed the top of my head. It's not up to me, Tay, he stated, then stood, grabbed his bag, and went back into the bathroom. I felt him watch me for a minute, but I didn't turn. I sat and rocked the little boy in my arms, and he curled up against me. Finally, I heard the shower start, and I turned, a sudden desire to go in there and join him. My face heated at the thought, and I blinked hard when Ryan walked in and looked down at us. I held Al tighter until he grunted, and then I relaxed my grip, just enough to let him breathe. Ryan sighed and squatted down in front of me. He needs to go back home, my alpha stated, although his voice was softer. Al started to cry, and I rocked him. Please, Ryan, he just wants to be with his brother, I pleaded, with my voice as well as my eyes. Ryan let out a long, slow breath. Raina, we aren't on vacation. Cal can hold his own here. We can't. I can hold my own, Al stated, turning his head and wiping his eyes. I can be a big help, and I won't get in the way, I promise. Ryan's mouth twitched in a smile, but then it disappeared. I have no doubt, but your pack needs you, he tried. My brother needs me, the small boy replied timidly. I just want to be with my brother. Ryan sighed again and stood. We'll talk about this after we eat. I flinched, knowing that no matter what Al or I did, Ryan was going to send him home. He gave me a firm look and then walked into the other room. Okay, so I couldn't keep him with us, but there had to be something I could do. Al jumped up, pulling his shirt up and wiping his face with it. I'm a big boy, he stated, and I smiled. Yes, you are. I can help do things, and I won't complain, even a little bit. He squared his shoulders, and I sat up on my knees. Well then, that's more than any of these other guys can do. He puffed out his chest, and then we turned to see Cal walk back in. His eyes were sad, but he smiled and went to scoop his brother up. Al jumped out of his reach. I don't need to be carried, Cal, he snapped. I'm here to help. I ain't no pup. Cal's brows rose, and I smiled. With that, little Al stomped through the door into the main room, with Cal walking out after him. I stood, still smiling, and then turned and looked at the bathroom door, walking over to it. The shower wasn't running now, and I lifted my hand and laid it on the wood. Then I gasped and jumped back when the door opened. Phil seemed just as surprised and then smiled. I took another step back and opened my mouth to say something. When I couldn't think of anything, I clamped it shut and just stood there. He walked over to me and I felt my knees go weak. He smelled clean. His hair was still a bit damp, and his scent filled all my senses. When he wrapped his arms around me, I did buckle just a little, but he held me to him. I love you, he whispered in my ear, and I felt like every bone in my body turned to gel. He nuzzled my neck, and I moaned, leaning into him. I said I love you too, but I could barely find the air to get the words out. He was so intoxicating. When he kissed my neck, I moaned again, reaching up and holding the back of his head with my good arm. Then I gasped when he bent down a bit and lifted me up into his arms. I smiled at him, and then his eyes changed, and a low growl came from his chest. I frowned, and he turned. I followed his eyes and moaned, seeing Track standing there with his arms crossed. My head flopped back, and all the good feelings dropped away. Did she pass out? I heard Ross gasp as he walked in. Who passed out? Did Raina pass out? It was Jackson this time, and I let out another moan. Hey Ryan, I think Raina passed out. Phil's growl grew, and I lifted my head as our alpha rushed into the room. He looked me over and then looked at Phil. Then he chuckled. Well, it seems she's come to now. My wolf smiled then and bounced me in his arms a bit to adjust me. I grunted and put my arms around his neck to hold on. Ryan slapped Track on the back. Come on, let's get ready for food. When Track didn't move, our alpha leaned forward. That wasn't a request. The others quickly left the room, and Track reluctantly followed, giving us a hard look over his shoulder. What in the world? I sighed, but Phil laughed and carried me to the bed. He laid me on my back and then crawled up on his side and looked down at me and just smiled. What? I finally said under his stare. If that shirt wasn't so big on you, I'd ask you to wear it all day. But I slept in it. I know. When I wrinkled my nose, he leaned over and smiled. You really don't get how much what that does to me, do you? Wearing your shirt? He nodded and I bit my lower lip. He said. I'm not sure how to explain it without sounding like a caveman, he chuckled. When I didn't respond, he shifted his weight and gave a half shrug. This is my shirt, he stated, laying his hand on my stomach. Yes, I whispered, the butterflies exploding at his touch. I have worn it. It has my scent and my claim, for lack of a better word. I blinked and he sighed. So when you wear it, my eyes widened and he held up one hand. I know that sounds a bit caveman-like, but I don't know how else to explain it. Suddenly I smiled. So it's like I'm wearing your shirt and saying I'm his. He moaned. Does that sound that bad? I giggled and stroked his cheek. No. It's very sexy. His eyes widened and I pulled him down to me and kissed him. We finally got up when the food came. I grabbed my bag that was now back at the foot of the bed and headed towards the bathroom. Luckily, there was enough hot water and I was able to relax and enjoy it. When I got out, I slipped into my jeans and then held up his shirt. Unfortunately, it was too big to wear regularly, but I liked that it was. Phil was tall, strong, and I lifted it and inhaled slowly. Then I folded it carefully and tucked it back into my bag. I peeked through and saw that he hadn't really tossed out my sleeping shirts. I pulled them out and set them to the side. I was his, and he was mine. Then I laughed as an image of him in one of my sweaters popped into mind. I grabbed the blow dryer and hummed to myself as I dried my hair. When I stepped back into the room, I walked over and tucked one of my sleeping shirts in his bag, then tossed the rest on the floor at the end of the bed. Phil smiled and stood when I walked out of the main room. I lifted my dripping splint and wiggled it a bit. Oh, right, he said, his brown eyes sparkling. Aaron jumped up and got the box. Ryan wiped his hands off, and he and Phil changed my splint. Ryan was pleased to see that the bruises were already yellow, which meant I was healing fast. He felt my arm and nodded. The bonus set well. I looked at Phil, who explained what had happened. Ryan gave me a look, and I nodded. I know. Raina, you have to be more careful. Got it. Our alpha chuckled and then stood and tossed the wet bandages in the garbage. Little Al walked over and looked down at my arm. Then he laid his hand very gently on mine. It's healing fast, I whispered to him. and he nodded but didn't smile. I sat back and he crawled up into my lap. Phil gave him a playful growl, and this time Al growled back. Then they both laughed. "Go finish your food," I said, smiling at Phil. "I already did," he stated, and then looked at the little boy in my lap. "I have to go home today," Al said quietly, looking at Phil and then up at me. When I looked at Phil, he nodded. "For now." "But Cal promised that as soon as everything is okay, he will come and get me." I blinked hard and turned back to Phil. "Cal wants to come live in Polson," he explained. When I turned and looked around the room, Cal nodded. "I already talked to Tom about it. He said as long as it's okay with your pack." Then I turned to Ryan, who shrugged. "We'll be happy to have them." "You called him? How is everything going?" He shook his head. "No, I talked to him right after you got to our camp." "Wow." I turned back to Phil, who smiled. "Don't get too used to that seat there either," he stated, shaking a finger at Al, who snuggled up into me and lifted his chin defiantly. Phil leaned down and gave another low growl, tightening his eyes playfully. "Or we might just have to square off." I laughed and hugged the little boy to me, and Phil leaned over Al's head and kissed me. "Hey!" Al shouted, pushing against Phil's chest. "I'm sitting right here, you know." Everyone laughed then. Soon after that, Al left with Rock and Cal to meet David, Track's dad, at a pickup point. David and the others would keep Al safe until they could take him back to Alsaw and out of the mess we were in the middle of. Aaron and Marcus followed on the bikes to make sure no one came back with them that shouldn't. Phil and Ryan disappeared into the bedroom for a bit, and I watched TV until I got bored, which didn't take very long. Then I paced. "You need to learn to relax," Jackson stated, plopping down on the couch and snatching the remote out of my hand. I rolled my shoulders and sighed. I can't stand being cooped up. His brows rose and I frowned. The manor is a lot bigger than this place. He shrugged and then nodded, and I returned to my pacing. Track sat in one of the chairs and watched TV and watched me pacing. I heard giggling outside and froze, then turned slowly to stare at the large window that now had heavy blankets over it. When I took a step forward, both Jackson and Track leapt up and stepped in front of me. "You know," I huffed, putting my good hand on my hip, "I have come in contact with humans now, and I haven't done anything stupid." Remember that female last night?" Track stated. I shrugged and he leaned forward. "The one that was just running after her mate to give him a list for the store?" "Oh." I lowered my head and sighed. "Well, she ran." "Humans do that sometimes," Jackson chuckled, keeping his eyes on the TV screen. I rolled mine and huffed. The giggling voices got closer to our room, and we all turned and watched, as if we could somehow see them through the thick walls. We couldn't, but with our hearing and sense of smell, we could pretty much track their steps. "Why do humans put on so many smells?" I whispered, half in awe, half in disgust. I rubbed my finger under my nose. One smell for shampoo, another for soap. I sniffed again. Then that perfume stuff, hair stuff, the stuff they wash their clothes in. I snorted a bit. Don't they realize it isn't all the same smell? The guys just chuckled, and our heads slowly moved to one side, tracing their progress as it passed our window, across our door, and then to the other wall. When the sounds faded, Jackson shrugged. "Man, I do miss females." "Hey!" I snapped, and he leaned over and kissed the top of my head. Ryan and Phil came out of the room and gave us all a hard stare. "What are you three up to?" our alpha asked, eyeing us all carefully. "Some females walked by giggling," Jackson stated, shrugging. "Raina wanted to stalk them. I just wanted to get a date." I turned and smacked his arm. He laughed and moved back to the couch. The furniture groaned as he plopped down on it. Track sat back in his chair and I stood, not quite sure what to do. "She's bored," Jackson put in, and then winked at me when I glared at him. Ryan looked at me and I frowned. "She doesn't enjoy sniffing the humans, though." I glared harder at Jackson, who shrugged. "I hope Al is going to be okay," I stated, trying hard not to look at the door and wonder about those smells. "Are you kidding?" Track chuckled, flopping one of his legs over the arm of the chair. "He has my mom and Phil's mom to gaga all over him." That made me smile and also made me feel better. I missed that little wolf, but he was probably being fed and showered with more attention than he could handle. "When are they coming back?" Phil stepped up to me. "They called a minute ago, and they're on their way back." There were gunshots on the TV. I glanced at it and quickly lost interest, although Jackson and Track quickly got into a heated battle over who they wanted to die first. I rolled my eyes and looked back at the door. Any chance I could go for a walk? "Did pigs sprout wings?" Track replied, and Jackson tried to muffle his laugh. I glared at the both of them, and Ryan shook his head. "Still not dark out, for one." "And this place is crawling with humans," Jackson put in, without taking his eyes off the TV. I had already taken a shower, didn't need to eat, and was bored out of my mind. Phil took my hand. "Why don't we go into the room and find something else to watch?" "What's wrong with what we're watching?" Track snapped, looking up. Ryan chuckled and walked over to a bag on the counter. Jackson kept his eyes on the TV, shouting at someone he thought was an idiot. Phil ignored my best friend, and we walked into the other room. He shut the door, and I giggled as I heard a low string of cussing from the other room. "I really used to like him," Phil chuckled, and I laughed again. We laid on the bed and watched TV. He propped himself up on pillows from both beds, and I laid on my side with my head on his chest. He channel surfed, and we finally settled on a talent show that started off with someone juggling bowling pins. Suddenly, being bored wasn't so bad. We quickly became addicted to the odd reality show, picking our favorites and arguing over who we thought should win. My guy was a contortionist, and he got voted off in the second round. That ticked me off, and Phil only laughed when I insisted it was all rigged. "It's TV, Tay. Of course it's rigged." I huffed and snubbed my nose at it. Stupid show. But we kept watching, and I ended up picking another favorite. I was so engrossed in it that I jumped when someone knocked on the door. The front door. Phil chuckled and went to sit up, but we both had our eyes on the set across the room. They were down to the final 4. Luckily, a commercial blared in, and we both jumped up and hurried to the bedroom door. Phil opened it and peeked out. The guys were back, and they brought food. I stayed in the doorway while Phil grabbed himself a quick plate, and then he headed back towards me. "Not going to eat out here?" Track asked, and actually tried to look innocent about it. My wolf shook his head. "Nope, better company in here," he stated, winking at me as he walked through the room. I smiled, turned, and followed him. He grabbed a chair and pulled it up next to the bed. "Don't want to get food all over our bed," he stated, and I felt a chill run through me. Our bed, I thought, smiling. It was like when he put his bag next to mine on the floor. It felt good. "By the way," he stated, situating his food in his lap, "my guy's gonna win." I jumped up, grabbed a hand towel off the bathroom, and lifted his plate, putting it on his lap. "Want to bet?" I grinned as I plopped back down on the bed. He blinked hard and then recovered quickly. "Absolutely." The show came back on, and with our eyes glued to it, we debated on what the bet would be. We finally settled on the loser will run the winner's shower and set all their things out for them for the rest of our trip. He had attempted other options and bit his tongue on even more. This was the safest one. I lost. I growled, threw a pillow at the TV, and yelled at the judges. Phil smiled and finished his food while he gloated. "Lovers spat?" Jackson asked, peeking his head in the door. I threw a pillow at him, but he caught it and looked at Phil. My wolf shrugged and explained the show, playing up his guy a lot. "My guy should have won," I snapped. "He could swallow 5 swords at once, all the way down his throat," I added, when Jackson only blinked. Phil wiped his hands on the towel and put his plate on the nightstand. "Sorry, Tay, but like I said, this is a guy's show, and my guy pulled an airplane with his teeth." Jackson whistled. "A human did that?" Phil nodded and started retelling the feats of Hercules. I huffed. "It's rigged," I stated, and stomped over to pick up the pillow Jackson had let dropped. "What's rigged?" It was rock, and I moaned and left the room as Phil and now Jackson started talking about that ridiculous human. It was a small airplane, I grumbled, and Ryan looked up at me. I shrugged, and he chuckled. "Reality show?" "There was nothing real about it," I snorted. "I've heard they can be a bit addictive." "No way. They're stupid, ridiculous, idiotic. How anyone could get hooked on something." "Tay, another episode's coming on," Phil hollered through the open door. I froze, and Ryan laughed. Track followed me in the bedroom this time, and soon we were all crammed on the 2 beds, rooting for our favorites to win. We argued with each other during commercials, and then the guys started to make bets between themselves. I tried to get in on it, but Ryan shut that down. "Sheesh, what was the harm?" "Leave her out of your musking," our alpha laughed as Track tried to make a bet that the loser had to sleep on the couch. Phil eyed him hard on that one. I didn't mention our bet, and neither did Phil. I was actually looking forward to it. Setting up his things in the bathroom, running his water. It seemed so couple-like, and he had basically done the same for me already. When that episode ended, Track had to iron Rock's shirt, and Cal had to refer to Aaron as his greatness. Boys. Chapter 16. The next day I woke up in Phil's arms again and laid there, quietly, while he slept. I was snuggled up next to him and felt his chest rise and fall with each breath. He was amazing, but how I felt about him was even more amazing. I couldn't imagine my life without him, and just the thought of it made my nose tingle. His long, dark lashes fluttered a bit, and I bit my lower lip. His eyes blinked open, and he looked at me and smiled. I smiled back and lifted up a bit, kissing him as he rolled towards me. "I like waking up like this," he whispered, and I nodded. "Gads, really?" Track moaned from the other bed. "Are we gonna have to listen to this every morning?" "I don't think it's morning," Rock yawned. "I think we're getting on Raina's sleeping schedule." Phil ignored them and ran his finger down my cheek, then softly over my lips. He turned his head to yawn and then smiled at me. I was having an amazing dream. Track groaned, and then so did the bed as he sat up. "What was it about?" I whispered, trying to keep my voice down. Nearly impossible in a room full of wolves. "You and I were off somewhere. Just the two of us, he stated the last part over my head, then turned back to me. I think it was in Europe. I smiled and snuggled up closer as he told me about his dream. We ignored Track's grumblings and Rock's comments. You were wearing a long white dress. My eyes widened and he chuckled. Not that dress, it was a summery type. Long but casual, and you looked amazing, Jackson teased as he plopped down behind me on our bed. You two are really overusing that word. This time he moved as Phil went to shove him, and he settled behind my legs, a little more out of reach. So, what part of Europe were we in? He added calmly, as if this was a group discussion. Were there any hot females there? It was my turn now. I shot my leg out and dumped him on the floor. You know, you are both werewolves, Rock stated, standing over us. I rolled onto my back and looked up at him. He nodded. Wolves are pack creatures, and we do almost everything together. Then he smiled. Jackson jumped up and was standing next to the other one. He's right, you know. Pack wolves are very, very close. He wiggled his brows and then leaned over, puckering his lips towards me. I laughed and Phil shoved him hard. In the same motion, Jackson crawled up on the bed and spooned me. I was trapped under the covers now, him on top of them on one side and Phil on top of them on the other. I squirmed a bit and Phil sighed. That's it. Next stop, you and I are getting our own room. Really? We all turned as Ryan walked in, running his hands through his hair to put it back in place. I bit my lower lip, and Jackson put his arm around me and cuddled me. Phil sighed and sat up. I tried to, but Jackson had a good grip on me. Let go, I laughed, trying to get my arms out enough to push him. Yeah, get out of my spot, Track growled playfully. Then he grabbed Jackson and pulled. Unfortunately, Jackson still had me in his arms, and we were both yanked off the bed. I landed with a thud, half on top of Jackson. Phil jumped up, pulled me out of the tangle of blankets, and stood me up, but he had a small grin on his face. They were right. We were werewolves, and pack life was a strong part of us. Since you two are up and so chipper, Ryan stated, looking at Jackson and then Track, you can go get breakfast. Track looked at me and I turned to Phil. I can go with them. Okay, so it was a long shot, but it got a good laugh from everybody. Just then there was a hard knock on the front door and the flurry of bodies almost made me dizzy. Phil and Track grabbed me and tried to pull me in different directions. I grunted and Track finally let go, Phil pulling me behind him. Jackson, Rock, Cal, and Ryan ran out into the main room. Another round of hard knocks. Cleaning service, came a voice from the outside. I smiled and went to tease them all for overreacting when Phil shook his head and put a finger to his lips. Seriously? Did they think that the cleaning lady was a threat? But I kept quiet. We're fine, Ryan stated. I gave orders not to be disturbed. Ooh. I tensed up now, and Phil started to look around the room. Track stepped in front of me, next to Phil, and Aaron stepped into the doorway. I'm sorry, they didn't write that on my list. It was a young woman's voice, and she sounded a bit irritated. Don't you at least want some fresh towels? We're fine, thank you, our alpha stated, letting his irritation out in his voice. I can come back later to clean. We will call if we need anything, he snapped. Yes, sir. Sorry, came the now mousy reply. Then we heard something heavy being dragged down the walkway. I perked up my ears. We heard her knock on another door, and I turned. Aaron turned and shook his head, and I frowned. A full minute passed, our rooms completely silent. Finally, Ryan called for Track and Cal. He told them to check out the cleaning lady on their way out for food. Track wasn't happy about leaving, but finally the two left, and everyone relaxed a little. Ryan walked to the hotel phone, pushed a button, and voiced his irritation at being disturbed when he left such specific instructions. I guess the person on the other end did a lot of apologizing because our alpha was quiet and finally nodded, muttered something, and hung up. When Rock and Jackson went into the front, I quickly grabbed Phil's bag and headed towards the bathroom. He put his hand on the door, stopping me. "You don't really have to do that." I shrugged. "If you lost, I would expect you to." He frowned and looked a little uncomfortable. I opened the door and ducked under his arms. He followed. There wasn't a lot of room in there, so I sat his bag on the counter. Then, ignoring him, I hummed softly as I pulled out a towel and then leaned into the shower to turn on the water. "Is this a group shower?" I yelped and stood up, then rolled my eyes as Rock stood with his arms crossed and a large smile on his face. "Sure," I chirped, then pulled a leather pouch from Phil's bag. I never understood it, but you always knew where to find a guy's toiletries. They all seemed to have that same leather bag with the domed top and a zipper. My dad had a similar one. When I sat it on the counter, Jackson stepped in. Now, we were really crowded. "What's up?" "We're taking a pack shower," Rock chuckled, still watching me. I went back to the bag, but Phil put his hand on my arm. I looked up, and he shook his head. "These two can suck the fun out of Disneyland sometimes," he stated, but his eyes said that he would have stopped me anyhow. What was the big deal? A bet was a bet. I had actually wanted to do it, and he had done the same for me. Sort of. I sighed and stepped back, the room now filling with steam. Jackson pushed his way in and smiled at me. "I'll wash your back if you—" Phil's fist moved so fast I barely saw it, but it landed square in the center of Jackson's chest. He fell backwards, landing on Rock, and they both tumbled out the door, landing in a pile on the floor. Phil's speed surprised me again, and he lunged, shoving their legs out of the way, and shut the door, then pushed the lock. My eyes widened. When he turned to me, he was laughing, and he stepped up to me. Suddenly, this felt a bit awkward. Here we were, locked in a small bathroom, alone, the heat from the steam sticking to me. "I think I need to have another talk with the boys," he whispered, dropping his voice a bit. That made my back tingle, and I smiled, standing against the counter. He came and stood in front of me, searching my eyes for something. "If we were in Europe," he whispered, leaning forward and moving my hair off my shoulder. I gave a small moan as his left hand on my neck and kissed my lips. Then he moved his hand to my hips, still kissing me, and lifted me up onto the counter. I groaned a bit, but I ignored it and wrapped my arms around his neck. Phil moved in closer, and my heart raced and pounded until I couldn't hear the shower. Intoxicating. I was overusing that word too, but I couldn't think of a better one. His scent filled me, every single part of me, and I moaned again. "Excuse me," came a voice from the other side of the door that belonged to Rock. I went to pull away, but Phil held me to him. "This is the honor police, and since the nurse wolf is out getting breakfast, We feel, Jackson chimed in. Yeah, we feel it's important to tell you," I sighed and Phil pulled back just slightly, "that we're going to have to break this door down if you don't open it." "No one is breaking any doors." Ugh, it was Ryan. Great. They were all out there and knew we were in here alone. Phil gave me another soft kiss. "If only we were in Europe right now," he whispered. "Phil?" came our Alpha's voice. Yeah, Phil replied, standing up a little straighter, but still holding me. We were nearly nose to nose, and I groaned when Ryan called my name. My yeah came out more like a squeak. See? Rock snapped. He can't be doing that yet. They aren't, they have to. Phil is not going to do anything he shouldn't, Ryan stated. But we both understood the warning. We heard him tell the others to get away from the door, and then I giggled. Phil smiled at me, gave me one more kiss, and then helped me down from the counter. He looked in his open bag, and I glanced down, seeing my t-shirt poke out. Another time I was glad I wasn't blushing. You could always drive them mad by staying in here, he stated, and my eyes nearly popped out of my head. Then he chuckled, went over, and opened the door, the steam floating out and the cold air finding my already tingling skin. I didn't finish the bet, I stated, heading toward the door. Next time, he smiled, then kissed me, and I walked out, rubbing my arms from the cold room. When I turned, he winked. I leaned over, smiling, and then grabbed the door handle and shut the door. He laughed from the other side, and I giggled and walked over to my bag, ignoring Rock, who was looking in from the other room. Honor police? I chuckled, setting my bag on the bed and looking through it. Why is it that the guys were suddenly so interested in my honor? They stalked females almost like prey, and I'm pretty sure they had steamed up a few bathrooms themselves. I sighed as I foraged through my bag. I didn't have a lot of clothes. Ryan, did you happen to bring my other bags? I asked as I stepped out into the main room. I didn't make eye contact, though, a bit embarrassed by the whole bathroom scene. I didn't have time to pack it all up, he said, walking over to me. We can get you whatever you need. It's okay, I need to do some laundry. Sadly, I had never done my own laundry, but how hard could it be? He chuckled, and I frowned. Hey, I could do my own laundry if needed. The guys can run to the laundry room, our alpha stated, and then saw the look of horror on my face. The guys washing my underwear? I actually shivered, and he smiled and shrugged. Well then, you'll have to wait a bit. I'll wait, I whispered, suddenly wondering about washing some things in the bathroom sink. I'd seen it done on movies. Shampoo should work. I asked again, where would I hang them up to dry, I thought, then growled. There were definite downsides to being the only female and not having my own space. I was so busy whining internally that I nearly jumped out of my skin when there was a hard knock on the door. Ryan put his hand on my shoulder to calm me. Track and Cal came back in with bags of food. Lots of bags. Did I mention that werewolves eat a lot? I plopped on the couch while Ryan changed my splint, checking my arm and rubbing some of that great ointment into my skin. There was no more swelling, and the bruises were lighter than yesterday. One more day with this, he stated, wrapping it back up. Then you should be able to get by with just an ace bandage, as long as you're careful with it. Might as well wrap it in steel, then, Track stated from the table. Ryan stood and went to the kitchen to wash his hands. We all turned when Phil walked out, and I smiled. He was so cute. I liked it when his hair was just still a little bit damp and tossed from being towel dried. My eyes took him in as he walked over to me. Oh yeah, forgot to tell you about Phil and Raina taking a shower, Rock said, looking directly at Track. My best friend nearly spit his food out and had to grab his drink to keep from choking. When he slammed the bottle on the table, Rock and Jackson were both nodding. Phil walked over and casually started to gather his own food. Ryan sat on one of the chairs and winked at me when I looked at him. Why wasn't he stopping what was about to happen? They're joking, right? Track growled, his voice so low, I almost didn't catch it. My wolf turned and looked at the other two. Why don't you ask them? My eyes got wider as Phil calmly added more to his plate, and then reached for that strange red stuff they like to put on their meat. Track turned and looked at Ryan, who ignored them all, or at least appeared to, and ate his food. Track seemed to mull the information over, then shook his head. No way Ryan would allow that, but he shot me a hard look that made me flinch, and then frown. I'm telling you, Rock stated, snatching a biscuit off Jackson's plate. They were both in that bathroom. And the door was locked, Jackson added. Rock looked at Jackson and nodded. Yep, locked. The shower was running and they were both in there. Both being Phil and Raina, he added when Track didn't seem to react enough. Cal and Aaron started to eat their food faster, and I wondered what they knew that I didn't. Once Phil was done, he cocked his head and gestured. Marcus stood and moved, coming to sit on the couch with me. Now Phil was sitting across from Track, and I swear it looked like he was trying not to smile. I blinked several times and looked at Ryan. Why wasn't he doing anything? Why wasn't I, for that matter? But I couldn't seem to react. I guess it was just a mix of being dumbfounded and wondering what was going to happen. Plus, Ryan was right here. It couldn't get that bad, right? We heard moaning, Rock stated, and that finally got a reaction. Track slammed his breakfast burger on his plate, but instead of glaring at Phil, he was glaring at the messenger. Shut up, Rock, Track growled. Jackson laughed and Rock shook his head. Man, me and Jay played honor police for you. Had to nearly knock the door down, and that's what we get? My best friend looked over at me, and for some reason, I turned and quickly started to ask Marcus about his food. I saw Phil's jaw twitch then, but he wasn't mad. He was holding back a laugh. I really didn't understand boys. It's called an omelet, Marcus explained, knowing I was only asking for something to do. When I kept looking at him, he told me what they were made out of and how they were cooked. I liked onions and peppers in mine. I looked over at Cal, who smiled. Jalapenos, Ryan put in, and the other two agreed and started listing off many things you could put inside one of these omelet things. Wow, pretty amazing blob of food there. Ryan, I know you just wrapped this, I stated, turning to my alpha quietly, but I need to take a shower. Ryan nodded, and Rock chuckled. Another one? So soon? Then Track moved lightning fast. He flew over the table, knocked several white boxes over, and spilling cups. Ryan sighed and calmly sat his food on the small table next to his chair. Go take your shower, he said, again calmly. I nodded, jumped, and nearly ran into the other room, shutting the door behind me. What in the world? I flinched when I heard a loud thud, followed by a string of cursing, and then several more thuds. Why was Track acting like this? He had never been this bad with Jonathan. Ouch. I put my hand to my stomach as guilt landed in it hard. My nose started to tingle and my eyes watered. He must hate me, I whispered to the empty room, oblivious to the yelling and thuds coming from the other one. Those breathtaking gray eyes floated in my mind and I could hear his voice. He had put his entire life on hold, practically moving into the manner to be there for me while I learned to shift. A few tears trickled down my cheeks as memories stalked me, laying down guilt like bricks and mortar. They grew so heavy. What kind of person was I? What had I become? He had loved me so completely, and how did I repay that? I fell in love with someone else and had forgotten about him. What was he doing right now? I blinked through the tears as I pictured him driving madly through the streets looking for me. Images of his apartment and papers piled on his desk tore at my heart. The pictures of our mini manor. My breath quivered. "I am so sorry," I whispered. "I didn't mean to hurt you." A wave of grief washed over me. How could I have become so cruel? I cried out and jumped when the door flew open. Phil rushed in, looked at me, and then around the room. He hurried over to me, and I dropped my head into his chest and cried. He tried to soothe me with his voice and his arms, but it didn't work. The memories were taunting and relentless. I remembered laughing with Jonathan on that stupid roller coaster, sitting on my bed after a bad shift, with him talking to me for hours. Then I remembered opening that beautiful little box, and my knees gave out. Phil caught me and carried me to the bed. The other voices blurred together behind him. "Tay, what's wrong?" he whispered. I couldn't tell him. Why didn't he think I was a monster? Maybe he did. Maybe the sayote was the only thing keeping him here. That and a sense of pack loyalty. I didn't answer and turned to face the wall, curling up into a ball. I wanted to disappear, silently begging to be sucked into some abyss and left there. It's what I deserved, and that way I couldn't hurt anyone else. And that's where I'm going to stop.